Without a doubt, the process of spiritual growth is long and often a very painful one. En route to maturity, we all spill our milk. We say things we shouldn't say, and at times we do not act our age. No matter what our age may be, we often don't act our age. Sometimes we act more like toddlers throwing temper tantrums. And the tragedy is that we often are unaware that what we're doing is wrong at the time. Other times we pout like little children, so self-centered that we simply don't care that we're misbehaving. Now, we have the knowledge, perhaps, but we don't have the will to do what's right. Even those who are spiritually mature, hear me when I say this, even the spiritually mature have days when they take a return trip to the terrible twos. It's not a pretty sight, but it's reality. Growing up is a stated objective for all of the members of God's family. Growing old happens, but growing up isn't automatic. We are all somewhere in the process of spiritual growth that hopefully will continue until our time on earth is done. The Apostle Peter provides a yardstick for spiritual growth, and it's very helpful. It's a tangible, objective set of checkpoints we can all use to measure the levels of our maturity in different areas. He summarized his comments and set forth 8 marks of maturity in his first letter. I'm referring to 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning at verse 8. Let me read the passage for you today. 1 Peter 3, verses 8 through 12. To sum up, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. For the one who desires life, to love and see good days, must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. He must turn away from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. During my most obnoxious years as a teenager, I remember receiving 2 pieces of advice, one of which was rather simple to obey, and the other one was much more complicated. Both of them didn't take long to say. The first one was simply, shut up. And I was able to accomplish that by keeping my mouth shut, which for some reason I found very difficult to do on occasion. So I was told that a number of times during my growing up years. But the other piece of advice I still receive in various ways, not only from other individuals, but from the Lord especially. And that is the counsel to grow up. And that's much more difficult to follow. You can find out if someone has shut up by simply watching and listening. If they stop talking, they've obeyed the command. But it's tough to know if someone has grown up or is growing up, isn't it? It's difficult to gauge that. How do you know when someone has grown up? Does it mean that their hair has started to turn gray? No, that means they've grown older, but not necessarily grown wiser and grown up. I was looking at Harold Netland's head a moment ago while I confess, my eyes were open on occasion, and he is growing older. There's a spot right here on his head that's growing larger, and there isn't hair there at the time. And I noticed that when balding begins to take place, not that you're bald, but when it begins to take place, you're growing older, but you're not necessarily growing up. I've met people whose hair is snow white who still are very immature. So showing signs of age in no way means that one is showing signs of maturity. To be told to grow up is easy to say,
but it's tough to know how to fulfill it. And it's even tougher to know if you're on your way. How do you know that you're growing up? How do you know, and how do I know that we are more mature this time at this time of the year than we were at this time of the year last year? How do we know that we are any more mature having lived a year longer? We know we're older, but how do we know we've grown up? And is growing up something that God wants of us? It may be He just wants us to live in His family, sort of exist between now and eternity, and then He's going to take us home. No, on the contrary, there is a stated goal for all God's children recorded in the 6th chapter of Hebrews. Maybe you haven't looked at it for a while, so let me address it while you watch, while you listen. Now, I think the chapter break in Hebrews 6 is most unfortunate because the writer has been talking about growing and learning. In fact, he has even said in chapter 5, verse 11, he has a lot of things he wanted to say to the readers, wanted to write to these readers that were hard to explain, and it seemed as though in a moment of frustration, simply said, I'm not going to worry with it. You become dull of hearing, and I'm not going to get into it. Verse 11, chapter 5, concerning Melchizedek, who is mentioned up in verse 10, we have much to say, and it's hard to explain since you become dull of hearing. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. How interesting that he puts it like that. You are back on baby food. I've had grocers tell me that their supply of baby food is depleted more by the aging than by the infants in their community. As you get older, you revert back, it seems, to childhood. And he calls it milk. You have come to need milk and not solid food. Now, in the physical life, that may be common, but in the spiritual life, that is not what God wants. For everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. Solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil. By the way, that is a great mark of maturity. You can't get much better than that in your checkpoints. To discern good and evil takes maturity. Now, on that context, he goes right into verse 1, therefore. And in verse 1, he states something that we should leave, and he states next something we should pursue. What should we leave? Therefore, leaving the elementary teaching about the Christ, let us pursue maturity. What are we to leave? We are to set aside the elementary matters of the faith. We are to place them aside so that we set out on a pursuit of maturity, growing up, not laying again a foundation of repentance from dead works and of faith toward God. I think, frankly, he has reference to the Old Testament signs and sacrifices and types. He's saying we've gone beyond that. Perhaps in today's terms, we could say, go on beyond the gospel. You have heard the gospel. You have responded to the gospel. You have believed the gospel. Now go on. Grow up. Get into areas of teaching and learning that touch deeply into your life and give you solid food, give you strength. In fact, I've heard it rendered leaving the ABCs of the faith, playing blocks and drinking milk and being entertained. Leave the things that characterize infancy and get on with a growing up lifestyle. That's what we're to pursue. Few things are more pathetic to behold than a person who has known the Lord for years, but still can't work his way out of a paper bag doctrinally, biblically. You've grown old, but you haven't grown up. Let me ask you something, just very frankly. Do you feed yourself on the Word of God regularly? Or must you have the teaching of someone else to keep growing? Now, I don't decry good teaching. In fact, that's the reason, that's my job security. There's a need at all times for someone to instruct us and exhort us in the things of God. But I don't do that because you have no way of taking it in on your own. I do that as a food supplement. Is all of your food something served by someone else? Or are you digging into it? Are you cracking open the Scriptures? Are you engaged in a ministry of concerted and prevailing prayer? Are you personally on your own growth chart, further along than you were a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago? Are you still needing just milk? Well, how do I know is a good question. How do I know I'm growing up? I need some checkpoints along the way. And it occurred to me when I looked into this grand, small section in 1 Peter 3 that what we have here is a series of checkpoints to help me know I'm growing up. I'm getting on in life. I'm not only growing older, I'm becoming more mature. Now, once again, verses 8 through 12 fall within a context of a series of other thoughts that began way back in chapter 2, verse 11. And the thought on Peter's mind, as he says in verse 8, chapter 3, to sum up, his summing up has to do with a series of thoughts he's been delivering in his letter regarding submission to authority. Or, as we've mentioned before, falling in rank under the authority of someone who is over us, who is in a position of superiority, if I may use that word. And it goes back to chapter 2, verse 11. Look at the different categories. In 2:11, these are Christians living in a secular society. I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul. Here is the Christian living in a secular world under the superiority of the lordship of Christ. Now there's another category. Verse 13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution. So these are Christian citizens who live under the authority of the Roman government. He describes them as kings in authority, governors sent by him for the punishment of evildoers. We are citizens and we are to live under the authority of our government, 2:13. In 2:18, he changes the subject to servants. Servants are to fall in rank under the authority of masters. Well, the servant could think, well, if I have a good master, I'll be obedient. He says, even if you don't have a good master, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, verse 18, but to those who are unreasonable. And so far, it's nice and safe. Everything's fine and dandy. That's all first century stuff till you get to verse 1, chapter 3. And then wives are addressed. Wives are told to fall in rank under the authority of their own husbands. I didn't mention this earlier, but the word own is very important. I know some wives who are more in submission to me than they are to their own husbands. That's not what God commands. Submission to me is not as important as submission to your own husbands, wives. Well, you say, that's fine if I have a good husband, but the passage is written to those who don't have good husbands, to those who have husbands who are disobedient to the word. You're in an unfair situation, and yet he doesn't give you grounds for getting out of it. Look at verse 7. Now the husbands, likewise, it's easy to miss that word, isn't it, man? There is a submission for us as well. I didn't say it last time, and I talked about the husband-wife relationship, but I needed to. If a husband is fulfilling the requirements of verse 7, he will have no trouble with his wife fulfilling the requirements of verses 1 to 6. Except in very sick cases, rare cases, I have not seen it fail. Husbands who correctly fulfill their job in verse 7 will not have trouble with their wives fulfilling their roles in verses 1 to 6. Now, to sum up, he kind of brings it all to conclusion. It's kind of coming down to a funnel. And he describes in verses 8 through 12 some of the qualities of maturity that you can check off to see how you're doing. I was flying, to Denver most recently, and I watched from the Ontario, California airport, I watched the pilot as he literally with a clipboard was checking off certain things on the plane outside, and when he walked in, I'm sure he finished his checking with the whole list of things. Here was a seasoned pilot. Here's a man with perhaps thousands, maybe tens of thousands of hours in the air, still with a clipboard, still with a pen, and checking off one after another before the flight. These are checkpoints before the flight. As I read over verses 8 through 12, I thought this is a good place to check them off. In fact, I think of them kind of like stair step, and I see 8 steps in the list of things that are here, and they're all very objective, and you don't have to know Greek to understand what they're saying. So let's sum up a checkpoint or a series of checkpoints for maturity. Let's see how we're doing as we're on our way from earth to heaven in this pilgrimage. First of all, let's put down the word unity. That is what I see in this word, let all be harmonious. Harmonious. It refers to a oneness of heart, a similarity of purpose, agreement on major points of doctrine. How are you doing there? Are you a person that promotes harmony? Please remember, it is not the same as uniformity. Uniformity has to do with everyone looking alike, thinking alike, dressing alike. It's what I call little cracker box mentality, where everyone must agree at every point, uniformity. It is not the same as unanimity, 100% agreement across the board. That's not the word used here. It is not even the same as union, which means you link arms and affiliate with all the other ministries around the world. That's not necessarily involved in the word harmonious. This word has in mind being like-minded, not allowing petty things to cause division. The great secret of unity, I have found, is focusing full attention on the person of Jesus Christ. Agreeing on points related to Him, His message, His kingdom, His model. Okay? First checkpoint. How are you doing in your maturity in the area of unity, being like-minded with other believers in the family of God? Second, I don't know quite how to put this next one called sympathetic. You would expect me to write or to think sympathy, but that's not quite what is conveyed. Let's put the words mutual interest. Mutual interest. We do get our word sympathy from this original term, but this word really means to feel with. It is the absence, get this now, of competition, envy, jealousy, and comparison. It is a feeling joy with those who are joyful, feeling pain with those who are hurting, feeling loss with those who have lost, feeling honor for those who are being honored. Some of the members of my family and I recently saw a film called Cry in the Darkness. It's the tragic story of a minister and his wife whose baby is in Australia is taken in a campground by a wild dog, and it is killed by this animal. And the campground where they're located is full of people who suddenly feel for this mother who's instantly lost her baby, as this baby is dragged off into the darkness by this dingo, by this dog. And the heartache that is felt by one mother after another who imagines what it must be like to have lost her child. And it's the story of how she is accused of killing the child, and how that all works out is a very intriguing and interesting film. Entering into the feeling of the other person. It's stated no better than in Romans 12:15, where we read, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep." 16, "Be of the same mind toward one another." Share in mutual feelings. I think it's "blessed be the tie that binds," speaks of mutual woes and mutual sadness and mutual joys. One of the wonderful things about being involved in church ministry is you have a context in which you can do that. And you can have that done with you and for you. You rejoice, there is a congregation that rejoices with you. That's one of the wonderful things, by the way, about being in ministry. You go from a particular church where God has blessed your efforts and He leads you to another. You don't just kind of drive into the city and get involved in an occupation and start a job and kind of work your way into the community. You are met with open arms by a church full of people who welcome you and receive you in and enter into your life. Right away, you're surrounded by a family. Now, a checkpoint for you. How are you doing in your mutual interest with other people's feelings? Do you give yourself into the feelings of others? When they hurt, do you hurt? When they enjoy life, are you enjoying it with them? When God blesses them wonderfully, do you applaud that? Or do you envy that? Or when they lose, do you feel the loss with them? Someone has said, maturity begins to grow when you can sense your concern for others outweighing your concern for yourself. It's so good. We've taught our children through their growing up years that the more selfish they are, the more immature they are. And it's still true today. Easy to grow up or to grow older and still be selfish, isn't it? Now back to 1 Peter. Third, let's put friendship and affection. 1 Peter 3, verse 8, to sum up, let there be unity, mutual interest, and here it is simply rendered brotherly. The word is Philadelphia, and it means human affection, brotherly love. It has in mind being an affectionate friend. Coleridge, the poet, I think it was, said, friendship is a sheltering tree. Such a wonderful word picture. Friends are people whose lives are like branches, and they provide shade, they provide refuge from the demanding and irritating and searing rays of the hot sun. You can find comfort by them. You can find strength near them. They are tree-like in that they reach out. They bear fruit that provides nourishment and encouragement. Isn't it interesting that when something occurs in your life and you're alone and you feel the need for shelter or for encouragement or help with it, you pick up a phone and call a friend. You want to connect with somebody else. Few things are more lonely than going through a sudden test and having no friend to call. Are you cultivating friends? Are there a few folks that will stand near you? I love Jay Kessler's line regarding one of his great goals in life is to wind up with at least 8 people who will attend his funeral without checking their watches. I think that's a great line. They're willing to carry his casket and go through the funeral without once checking their watches. You have 8 people that'll do that? 10 or 12, 1 or 2, 6 or 8? To sum up, let all be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, a friendship and an affection. There's a fourth, compassion. It says it right here, kind-hearted. The term is most interesting. It has to do with the deep-seated organs of the body. Are you ready for this? The intestines. Those organs that are deep within the abdomen of the body. It was believed by the Greeks that these organs were the seat of emotions. And he uses a term, Peter does, for deep-seated feelings within the body. It's used in Hebrews 4:15 for Jesus who is touched with the feelings of our infirmities. It's used in Matthew 9:36, where he's seeing the multitude is full of tenderness for them because they're like a sheep. They're like sheep without a shepherd. He had compassion for them. He was touched deeply. In our high-tech era, it is very easy to become untouched, untouchable. The freeway requires that you keep moving no matter what you see occurring. The pace we live requires that you not take time. You go right on. After all, you read the stories in the morning newspaper of people who stopped to help and they were mugged. And you learn not to do that. Of course, there has to be discernment, but where is the tenderness? I think of Ephesians 4:32. Ephesians 4:32. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted. It's the tender mercies that are still needed. Well, these are checkpoints. How are you doing? Unity, mutual interest, friendship, compassion. Number 5, humility. And humble in spirit. It means lowly and bowed down in mind. It is an internal thing. Internal. It isn't public appearance of humility. It isn't a show of humility. It isn't looking humble. It is being humble in mind. That, again, is tough to find. In our day of self-help and promoting people to celebrity status, it is very difficult for an individual to maintain humility. If you are blessed and you are gifted, you are used by God, it is easy to start believing your own stuff. And he says in this 8th verse that one of the marks of a mature life is humility of spirit. I like this. One man says, maturity is the ability to do a job, whether you're supervised or not, to finish a job once it's started, to carry money without spending it, and last but not least, the ability to bear an injustice without wanting to get even. Those are marks of humility. You don't have to be supervised to get a job done. What you start, you finish. You're able to handle the money without spending everything you've got, and you don't have to always get even or fight back. So far, Peter has written about how we think, being like-minded and humble-minded. He's written about how we feel, sympathetic, affectionate, and compassionate. in the last three, verses 9 and 10, he writes first about what we do and then finally about what we say. Look at verse 9. Not returning evil for evil. So this, number 6, would be forgiveness. Following humility is a willingness to forgive. And I don't know of a verse that says it better when forgiveness is carried out than verse 9. Not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. Isn't that a great verse? Look at the steps in it. Look at the process. First of all, when there is true forgiveness in the heart, there is a refusal to get back or to get even. You put it to bed. You give it to God. You come to terms with it with the Lord. You do your best to make amends with an individual, but you refuse to get even or to get back. Second is the restraining of saying something as ugly as was said to you or about you. Notice how he puts it, not returning insult for insult. Third is clearly returning good for evil, where he says giving a blessing instead. Doing something nice in return to someone who has done something ugly to you. And fourth, you were called for that very purpose, keeping in mind that you were called to receive such treatment. That's easy to miss that, isn't it? I thought at first I was misreading it, and then I went back to chapter 2, verse 20, and found that's what he says over there. So he must mean it. Look at 1 Peter 2:20. What credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. Next verse. Here's the verse. You've been called for this purpose. You've been put on earth for the purpose of taking the brunt without retaliating. You've been called for this purpose. Look at Christ, who suffered for you, leaving an example for you to follow his steps. How do I know I'm growing up? When I stop fighting back. When I stop, when I take the chip off my shoulder. When I stop working on my quick, sarcastic answer to give back to someone who jabs me with a sarcastic punch. I know I'm growing up when I can control my tongue, and that's number 7. Back to 1 Peter 3, verse 11. Or verse 10, let him who means to love life and see good days refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking guile. How do I know when I'm growing up? I know it when I'm able to control my tongue. You knew I'd get around to this one, didn't you? It seems to be threaded throughout the New Testament. This verse and the one that follows, these verses are taken from the 34th Psalm. Here Peter says, refrain your tongue from evil. In fact, the word refrain could literally be rendered stop. Stop your tongue. Show me a person who has learned to refrain from gossip, who can refrain from telling confidential information, who can refrain from passing judgment without knowing the facts, and I'll show you somebody on the grow. Let me say it again. Refrain from gossip, refrain from telling confidential information, and refrain from passing judgment without knowing all the facts. And I'll show you somebody who's maturing. Don't miss the beginning of verse 10. Let him who means to love life. Isn't that great? And see good days. You want to really love life? You want to see good days? Get control of your tongue. Life will be happier for you. It'll even be easier for you. You'll see better days. I remember, was it from jolly old England, where that grave marker is? Beneath this clay, beneath this sod, a lump of clay lies Arabella Young, who on the 21st of May began to hold her tongue. It takes a while for you to get that, but it'll come about 10:30 tonight. Finally, she learned to control her tongue when she passed on. Will it take that? No, it need not take that. Pray about the use of your tongue. Pray that God will put a muzzle on your mouth when someone says, I'd like you not to share this with anyone. That includes your children. When they share something in confidence, it's in confidence. Believe me, I know I'm a preacher, and I know how tempting it is to take something they say and to use it in an illustration. I've got a friend up in the Northwest who pays his kids a royalty of $1 every time he uses them in an illustration. They're giving him illustrations at times that they're happy for him to use. Turn to Psalm 141. You'll like this. Psalm 141 puts it so clearly. And from the ancient writings of David. It's a prayer, and a great prayer to begin the day with. Psalm 141:3. Set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. I love that. Set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. A mark of maturity is a controlled tongue. Well, how are you doing? Unity, mutual interest, friendship and affection, compassion, humility, true forgiveness, a controlled tongue, and one more. Purity and peace, verses 11 and 12. Let him turn away from evil and do good. That's purity. Let him seek peace and pursue it. That's peace. For the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous. You think he doesn't watch? You think he doesn't care? Well, listen, his ears attend to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Take a look at the list, okay? That's quite a list. We're told to grow up. We're told to press on to maturity. How can you know if you're on the right road? Go back over that list. Do a checkpoint on your life at the end of a week or the end of a month. And by the way, areas of trouble, and we all have them. We have weak points along the way. In fact, I don't know of a one that isn't a struggle for me at times in my own life. Then that's what you pray about. See, he says, the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous. His ears attend to their prayers. Ask God for strength in these areas. Let me show you a grand verse. 2 Chronicles 16:9. 2 Chronicles 16:9. For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. Tucked away in the midst of the chronicles of the Hebrews is this wonderful statement of promise. It's a picture of the roving eyes and ears of our God, to use terms that all of us can understand. Though he is without eyes and without ears, being spirit, he is omnipresent everywhere at the same time, and he is roving this earth, moving to and fro throughout it, that he may support those, not simply find us serving him, but he may support those whose heart is completely his. That's our ultimate goal, to have a heart that is completely his. That'd be wonderful. Back to 1 Peter. Here's a good series of checkpoints. To sum up, As a child of God, let all of us be committed to harmony. That is a spirit of unity. Let all of us be engaged in a mutual interest in one another's lives. Third, let all of us be engaged in a development of friendship that is marked by earthly affection. This isn't agape love. This is human love, philos, affection. This is what my kids call hugs and kisses love. This is touchable love. This is love that is exhibited. It is demonstrative. I've heard people say, well, I love, but I love in my heart. Oh, wouldn't you love to be married to somebody like that? I'm just going to love you in my heart. We're not going to touch, just going to love you in my heart. This is touching love. This is affectionate love. Compassion is fourth. To sum up, let us all be kind-hearted. Fifth, let us be marked by humility in spirit, a mind that is set on the other individual. I had one more great statement on this. It can be said without qualification that no human being can consider himself mature if he narrows the use of his efforts, talents, or means to his own personal advantage. The very concept of maturity rests on the degree of inner growth that is characterized by a yearning within the individual to transcend his self-concentration by extending himself into the lives of others. In other words, maturity is a stage in his development when to live with himself in a satisfying manner, it becomes imperative for him to give as well as to receive. The truly humble person looks for opportunities to give himself or herself, to release. Forgiveness, controlled tongue, purity, and peace. Wow. That's quite a list, isn't it? But I am so glad that pilot, before we took off, took the time to check off the list. I'm glad he didn't shrug his shoulders when he saw a bulge on one of the tires and say, well, we'll just kind of hope for the best. We hope we make it. I'm glad he didn't ignore inside that cockpit some very important things which he must have checked 1,000 times in his career. None of these is new. But all of them need to be returned to again and again and again. Father, thank you for the reminder this very day of things that are so much a part of our lives, it seems as though we've come back to familiar territory again. We have. How often we have come asking for help in one or more of these areas. You've heard my pleas on many occasions. And this very moment, we thank you for the Lord Jesus Christ, our model and friend, our master, who fulfilled each of these and 1,000 others to perfection, though fully man. Thank you for the hope there is that there is a life to be lived like he lived and in the power in which he lived it. Use these closing moments of worship in our lives to soften our spirits, to bring back to our attention things that need to be addressed. May we come again to the cross and find there complete, encouraging satisfaction for Jesus' sake. Amen.
The preceding message, Hope Beyond Immaturity, Maturity Checkpoints, was copyrighted in 1988, 1990, 1996, 2006, and 2010, and the sound recording was copyrighted in 2011 by Charles R. Swindoll, Inc. All rights are reserved worldwide. Duplication of copyrighted material for commercial use is strictly prohibited.